everyone, and welcome to the Polar Bears International Tundra Connections program. We are out on Buggy 1 in Churchill, Manitoba, and it's polar bear season, so we have polar bears just outside our window. And we've been together, this great group of panelists and we've been together on this buggy and at the lodge all week doing webcasts, and this is our last one this week. And our theme today is connecting climate change in our backyard to ecosystems around the world. And what the inspiration is for our session today will actually be artwork and images that young people have submitted from across Canada and around the world. And I'd love to be able to hear your comments and reflections on your own experiences of climate change in your backyard as we share throughout the chat. So there are different ways for you to be able to participate. Our main audience is students across North America and around the world, and you can send in your questions or your reflections by putting them in the chat window on the Polar Bear TV page. You can email questions at pbears.org or on Twitter at Polar Bears or hashtag Tundra Connections. So now I'd like to introduce our incredible team of panelists. My name is Jennifer Corriero. I am co-founder and executive director of Taking It Global, and I'm your host for today. Taking It Global is a partner of this webcast today, along with the Global Encounters program at the Center for Global Education. So Gerrit, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Gerrit Wesselink. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Youth Arctic Coalition. So I have the incredible chance to work with young people who live in all 8 of the Arctic states, the US, Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Russia. So I'm here to talk a little bit about what young people are doing in the Arctic and what young people can do about climate change going forward.
Jack?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Jack Omelak. I'm the executive director of what's called the Alaska Nana Commission. The executive director means that everybody that works for me gets to yell at me and tell me what to do. So I am from northern Alaska. I'm having a great time here in Churchill, out on the Tundra Buggy 1. Being around so many smart people. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being with us. And our last panelist is Jen K.
Hi everyone, my name is Jen, and I'm a professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And my background is in climate and climate change. I do a lot of research on sea ice, clouds, how the climate system works, basically. And I'm excited to share with you today. I'm looking forward to seeing your artwork. I think art is just such an expressive way to communicate. And as a scientist, it's a lot about communication too. So looking forward.
So many perspectives here today. You have a professor, scientist, a student, executive directors before you, people who are influencing policy, polar bear management. So we really do look forward to your questions as they come. Now, I'd like to share a photo with you. Just last week, I was in Arviat, Nunavut, and Elise is going to put that photo up there for you on the screen. And I was working with high school students at John Arnalujiak High School as part of Global Dignity Day. And you can see there, as part of our message in promoting dignity among people around the world, that we created artwork together and a great group of volunteers, and volunteering is definitely one way to make a difference. And I had a chance to speak to one of the students there. Her name is Juliet. And you're going to hear from Juliet in just a moment. We're going to now bring up another photo. So there was a group of students who put together some artwork on this topic of climate change in their backyard. And so Nunavut is a very northern part of Canada in the Arctic, and so the youth here in Arviat creating this art, I felt this one was quite abstract, where it looked like it was some sort of spirit eating, swallowing the planet. You see those eyes, the red eyes, taking over and linked to the head of this kind of creature. You have the toxic signs, you have light bulbs that haven't been turned off, you have some sort of truck polluting into the air, and so you see these different sort of aspects of pollution, and a little bit further the way you say the fumes of the city going up, and a big ship in the center, and a very sad earth, and at the tail it looks kind of like a fire, I noticed. So I just thought we might start with that image. I was impressed with the abstract nature of the artwork, and so I wanted to lead with that. And now I would like for us to hear from one of the students. Her name is Juliet, and she created a drawing to express her feelings about climate change in her backyard.
Hello, my name is Juliet and I made this artwork. As a kid who grew up in the north, I always thought we'd always get the same big amount of snow every year, but I started to notice changes in the seasons. It's insane how much the climate has changed in a short period of time. It really worries me, but I can't do anything about it because I'm just one person. I can't make the whole world look at things in my perspective. The world doesn't deserve unwanted crazy heat. Not all people are destroying the world. There are many people trying to make a good change in the world, but it's not enough.
Thank you so much, Juliet, for sharing that. And I must say, it really does take a lot of courage to have this feeling, to share concern, to express it through art, and then to be able to get up in front of the camera and speak about it. So thank you, Juliet, for being a spokesperson for Makviet. Now, I'd like to ask Jennifer to really respond to that photo. And if you want to take another look at it, we can bring it up on the screen as well. Can you talk a little bit about the science of climate change and what's happening and how it might relate to what you see here in Juliet's photo?
Well, Juliet is so articulate in the things she's drawn. I mean, I've seen things that have changed over my lifetime as well. So in the late 1970s, about the time that I was born, there was about twice as much Arctic sea ice coverage in the Arctic in late summer. So that's a pretty big change to happen over my lifetime. I'm a little bit older than Juliet, of course. I also want to just, take a moment for a little educational opportunity here, just so we're all clear on what climate and weather are. So the way I like to describe that is, climate is what you expect, and weather is what you get. So Juliet's expectations are definitely changing right now when she's thinking about what will happen for the next couple of generations. And that's the right time scale. That's the time scale that climate change is going to be a huge challenge for this planet if we don't do something about increasing greenhouse gases. Mm-hmm. So very, very awesome and just powerful artwork. Wow. Mm-hmm. Good job, Juliet.
So this is all about reflecting on climate change in our backyards, and I was asking you a little bit about your backyard in Boulder, Colorado, and I'm wondering if you can talk to us all about the glaciers, and maybe we can bring up that photo of a book about the glaciers melting.
Sure, yeah. So my cousin, she actually works for the National Park Service, and she sent me this photo of a book, and she said, Jen, you really have to get this book. It's about the glaciers melting, which I know you're very passionate about, and it features a pika. And pikas, they depend on having the cold temperatures and having a certain environment. So as the climate warms, the pikas are moving up in elevation. But, we have some pretty big mountains in Colorado, so they can go up for so long. But at some point in time, they run out of places to go up to. And so just like the polar bears on the sea ice, they're losing their habitat, and it's a pretty striking thing to see just in my backyard in Colorado.
We have another image that we'd like to share with you of a student who's created an interpretation of the glaciers melting, and this student is part of an international project called Decarbonize, where we are inviting voices of youth from around the world to share images and artwork. And in fact, this invitation extends to each and every one of you. So thank you to all the students who have taken part so far, and to this incredible image that we see here on the screen. And this was captured in a video conference just last week. All right, now we're going to move on over to hearing from Jack, who is from Alaska, and we're going to actually understand Jack's perspective of climate change in his backyard, and one of the sources of inspiration will be what he shares with those youth in Nunavut, which is polar bears. So there's an image of a polar bear that we're going to bring up on the screen right now, and it's an image of a mom and her bear cub. This was done by a grade 12 student, again at John Arnalujiak High School in Akviet, Nunavut. a polar bear holding on to her baby cub. I'm reading from the writing there. I decided to draw this image because there are mostly polar bears in the town and almost every night. And so as the sea ice melts, a lot of the bears are spending more time on land. And actually one thing I noticed last week was that they were looking around near the garbage dump. So Jack, can you talk to us a little bit about polar bears in your backyard?
Sure. Actually, I want to start out by talking about sort of the first photo we seen with the young lady and talking about the amount of snow where it used to go up to her roof. It made me think about the time when I was growing up. I don't know how many of you kids have done what's called flipping. And so that's when the snow was so deep, we'd climb up 2 or 3 stories and flip off the building, trying to land on our feet or trying to land on our back. And I remember that one of the greatest times in my life was when we broke into the school and climbed up on the roof. And that was 4 stories high, and we were jumping off of that. So, you know, the snow there was easily sometimes 15 to 20 feet deep. You know, the winter time now, we can't do flipping like we used to because the snow was only 3 or 4. We'll end up breaking our neck or something. So anyways, about the polar bear and the cub on the piece of ice there, when I saw that, so I want to be careful about what I'm saying here because we are talking about conservation in a couple of different ways. One, you have local people who depend on polar bears as a source of food on the table. And then you have outside influences like government or law enforcement who see conservation as a different way. So when I see the picture of the mother and the cub on the piece of ice there, it reminded me of something that I think is absolutely critical. What is difficult is that us people who live intimately with polar bears, who see polar bears outside our back door, understand them in ways that people who do not live amongst them do. So one of the things that I deal with as a policymaker is we have people, say in Washington, D.C., I'm an American, or we have legislators that think that regulations need to be developed. What I'm talking about is these regulations affect Native people's ability to feed themselves. And so when I see the picture of the polar bear with the cub, it was 50 or so years ago when the Native communities in northern Alaska decided that they would not shoot polar bears with cubs for food, even though it was very important to them. So what I'm getting at is Native people have sort of natural values and laws for conservation. And so when we're talking about developing formal laws, meaning regulations or international agreements, those Native people's natural laws should be incorporated into what we're calling conservation strategies.
And I hope we can all take a closer look at the land that we're living on and who those indigenous communities are, and understanding some of those natural laws and the values behind the decisions that families make and how they feed themselves. Now, one thing that I learned about Jack is that as much as he spends a lot of time working with polar bears, he has a special place in his heart for the walrus. So there's a photo that we were actually looking at yesterday here on the buggy of the walrus on explore.org. And Jack was telling me some stories about the walrus, as there are many in his backyard. So I'm hoping you could tell us a little story about why the walrus is so important to you.
Well, the first thing I thought when I saw that picture was it made me hungry. Walrus are very important to rural Alaska as a food source. So you have to remember, just like in rural northern Canada, there are very few roads. You're lucky if you get a store. There's no infrastructure, or relatively little, I should say. So people have to feed themselves on a daily basis. And if you think about the fact that because of our harsh and extreme weather, there isn't a whole lot of way to grow grain, crops, vegetables, gardens, those sorts of things. So we rely heavily on going out to the ocean and feeding ourselves that way. Walrus are a big part of that. And I don't know how many of you that are watching actually eat walrus, but they eat clams and those sorts of things off the bottom of the ocean. And so sea ice is very important because they can't dive too deep to get the food that they want. So it's absolutely crucial that they have this thick sea ice that floats around the ocean that allows them to feed, which in turn feeds a lot of the native people. For those of you that do eat walrus, though, one of the added treats of harvesting a walrus is you get to eat the clams that's in their stomach. And so the stomach acid cooks the raw clams for you, and it's one of the best meals I've ever had. So what we're dealing with polar bears, meaning a loss of habitat or sea ice, is also going to affect walrus. And I hope that the problems that we deal with in regards to polar bears can then be applied to allowing us to work towards conservation of other species such as walrus and such as what we are calling ice seals.
Well, thank you for sharing that insight with us, and also for your passion for conservation and helping us to understand what conservation means from an Indigenous perspective, and how important it is for us to ensure that people who live off the land can continue to live off the land. There's another collage I'd like to show you now. Again, more images from Arviat, and these are some of the other images that have come through this art contest. You don't see a walrus in this picture, but you do see a seal up top. And then what is it there below, Jack? What are those, do you think?
Wolves.
A wolf and 2 wolves, you think?
I think so.
Yeah, 2 wolves. And the other thing that I had the pleasure of experiencing was having my first caribou. So you can see a photo of that coming in. I'm there on the right. We actually organized a feast in the community, and one of the themes this week here on the Buggy is really looking at what we can do and how can we raise awareness. And my trip last week involved having a feast with members of the community. We incorporated elders who taught us bead making, and there was throat singing and art making. And I think that art can be a really powerful way to create awareness and also to share in cultural exchange. Actually made a dish that my grandmother taught me, which is a very tasty sweet potato dish with apples, cinnamon, onions, and maple syrup. So speaking of loving the land, I'm going to take you to another photo. Do we see a polar bear out there? Is there? Okay, so I'm going to take you to another photo, and this one is actually a collage back from students from around the world reflecting on climate change in their backyard. And there is a theme here that we see, a little concern there. Jen, I don't know, what do you think about this Earth on Fire and the fireball? It's a theme that's come up. Can you comment on that and maybe some concern that young people are feeling about the Earth turning into a fireball?
Well, it's a very sensitive thing. I mean, 2015 is likely to be the warmest year on record, so I don't know if it's a fireball in the sense of, flames coming out of the top of the earth, but, as a climate scientist, that art really describes how I feel. So I think in that sense, it's very expressive and really powerful.
Thank you. Well, now I'm going to take you to another image, and this one was actually shared by Gerrit, who is from Thunder Bay. And so, Gerrit, can you talk to us about climate change in your backyard?
So I'm born and raised in a city called Thunder Bay, which is up in northwestern Ontario, and it's kind of the northwestern corner of the Great Lakes system here in North America. And the photo that you see here is looking out from the coast of my my home city out into Lake Superior, and you see just on top of the ship there a shape that looks like a man on his back, and we call him the Sleeping Giant. And the reason I wanted to talk about this one, especially in regards to climate change in my backyard, is Thunder Bay is extremely dependent on the lake. When you leave the city, there's literally nothing for hundreds of kilometers in any given direction. So we do depend on the lake, but we've started to notice a lot of changes. One is zebra mussels. That was never something that was in our part of the Great Lakes system, but now it's something that our pier, our marina, and even the boats are getting covered in because of changes in lake water and because now these animals are able to survive a little bit further north. And my dad, he actually works at the port in Thunder Bay as a security guard, and he was telling me that, year after year they noticed that, or not they notice, it's fact that the shipping season is a day, 2 days, 3 days longer every single year. And it's been like that for probably the last decade that we've seen those changes. So, at a weather perspective, Thunder Bay does get from the minus 40s up to the plus 35, so we have that range, but we're noticing that our winters are slowly becoming a little bit shorter. Harsh as they are, starting to become a little bit shorter, and we're starting to see those changes happen.
And what are some of the key messages that you've worked with from across the Arctic and the many countries that you visited and youth from those countries that you've talked to? What are some of the other messages that they want to share and that they're bringing to world leaders in upcoming weeks as part of the UN climate negotiations?
Well, I think, and especially in the Arctic region, there are so many different stories. There's so many different experiences from all corners of the world, and especially about climate change. It's something that we see across the Arctic, and it's something that we see around the world. So going into, as Jen was saying, the climate negotiations later this month and next month in Paris, there are a lot of young people who are trying to share those stories and who are trying to talk to officials and government leaders from around the world about what's happening in their community. And going with that, I encourage young people to keep talking about this. I was saying in the other webcast, we're the connected generation. We're the first generation that has access. We're able to talk to anyone anywhere in the world at any time, and that's extremely powerful. We can share that information, and when we do that, we encourage our leaders to continue that conversation.
Well, thank you, and thank you for all that you do. Now, I see that there's a question coming in online. What is the best way for us to slow down global warming? And I'm going to bring that question to Jen, but before she answers it, I'd like to bring up another image, and this is a bird that is in Nigeria, and I'll help read the description here, and so Jen can then reflect on how we can slow global warming. So this lonely ibis bird on Okababa Sawmill in Lagos, Nigeria. A great number of trees are falling, some of which are used as canoes, while the vast number of them are abandoned on the Lagos Lagoon. This brings about the introduction of exotic species, which are being displaced from their primary habitat as their major source of survival. And in the long run, it leads to the extinction of their species. The birds' population are gradually lost due to environmental degradation, due to pollution, and a changing climate. So it's kind of a bleak photo. It's a powerful image there, and I thought, Jen, that you could reflect on that and what we can actually do to change things.
Yeah, very bleak photo. I mean, it's really just tragic when you see loss of habitat for birds, for polar bears right outside our windows here. I mean, it's tragic. And there are some things, that you can really do to make a difference to help that. One is to, think about conservation efforts and think about how you can help people around you who are trying to conserve natural habitat and keep it there for the long term. But there's something also that all of us collectively need to do if we want to reduce the warming, reduce the changes in the climate we've seen. We have to reduce greenhouse gases, and that's really the challenge, I think, of my generation and the next generation. Because if we don't really do something about it, it's really going to be very warm on this planet, much warmer than it's been for a very long time. And some of the artwork we've seen today has expressed that so well. Some basic things happen when it gets warm. The ice melts, we lose habitats. It gets harder to find water because it evaporates more. There's a lot of things that we will be affected by, and it's not just about this bird or not just about the polar bears, but it's kind of about all of our habitat and what we want the next generations to have.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and it just highlights a sense of urgency, and there's such an important role that we all have to play, and that's been a huge theme this week, is that we want to sort of face the reality in terms of the trajectory that we're on, and we want to save the planet and save the people that live on it and all the beautiful creatures that are part of it. There's another question that has come in, and I'm going to ask this one to Jack, and before you answer it, I'm going to bring up another photo. So this question is, how will a loss of habitat affect the food chain. And the image that I want to bring up is actually one from Taiwan. It's called Organic Garden Dream. We had an organic garden at our school campus since 2008. My elder sisters joined the action to grow vegetables at school. Since Taiwan often has typhoons in the summer, we observed all of the changes typhoons brought to us. I even had a report during the 2015 Natural Disaster Youth Summit in Toyota City in January 2015. I'd like to let more people care about the damage which climate change caused. It's our duty to protect our motherland, and we can start from our backyard where we can find near or around us. So I really appreciate this example of both climate change, but also that action, people creating their own community garden, and this whole idea of growing, the food that you eat. I've heard stories, many stories and examples of young people taking on action projects, which includes, growing the food that they eat. People who may live off on a farm or in the suburbs, or people living in buildings and finding ways to grow fruits and vegetables. So thank you for sharing that with us. And so back to you, Jack, and maybe we can bring up that diagram as well in terms of the food chain. So how will the loss of habitat affect the food chain?
Well, there's one important distinction that needs to take place when we enter into a discussion about the food chain or the food web. The picture that's on the screen right now is an excellent example. Are we talking about a food web or the food chain that includes humans, or most times humans are left out of the food chain? And so I want to make that distinction. So what tends to happen at times is that conservation strategies to conserve resources such as polar bears often comes at the expense of the native people that utilize them. So I think we need to begin understanding that food webs include the human aspect as well. So if we're talking about how will a loss of or degradation of the marine environment or polar bears or the polar bear habitat affect us, we can look at it in one of several ways. For rural native people who depend on resources, one of the common sort of understandings about life, at least in rural Alaska, and I don't want to speak for rural Canada, but I know the conditions are very similar, is around 70% of rural Alaska's native intake of food comes from either the ocean or terrestrial resources such as fish, salmon, berries, leaves, those sorts of things. So what I'm getting at is the marine environment is a very rich resource. It's not just polar bears that people depend on for food. It's whales, and everything in those marine environments depend on that. And so you may have heard from time to time is that since we don't have those gardens like the organic garden there in Taiwan, often the ocean is our garden. And so that is what we use to go out and basically pick food from that garden on a daily basis. So it's absolutely critical for the people of the North to be able to continue to use that resource as long as it's healthy. And so the loss of habitat has some pretty profound effects, not just on the people that live intimately and directly on a day-to-day basis, but of course for the rest of the world as well. And some of you may be going on to higher educations, and we're all working towards the same thing, whether it be environmental justice, conservation of the species, but you have to be careful in balancing our efforts, because we don't want our efforts of conservation, environmental justice to essentially displace or affect negatively the people that depend on those environments.
Thanks for highlighting the importance of us seeing ourselves within the ecosystem and the role of our efforts, of our conservation efforts. There's some questions here that I wonder if there's someone else on the buggy who might be able to answer it. They're from an elementary school, and we happen to have a biologist on the buggy with us, so I might be directing these ones to you, Elisa, so you'll get to hear a word from Elisa. For those who are regulars of these webcasts, you'll get to wave. So there's 2 questions from an elementary school that have come in Texas. If it is so cold in the tundra, how do the plants behind you survive? That's number 1. And number 2 is, how much has the population of polar bears gone down in the past 20 years?
Sure. So let's start with the tundra. The tundra environment is characterized by a short growing season and cold temperatures. So yeah, it seems like how are plants living here? But there are times of the year when there's lots of sunlight and it's much more temperate here, and it even gets pretty warm here in July and August. So plants do have at least a few months of time to grow and get a little bit bigger or get those nutrients every year. And then for much of the rest of the year, they're kind of just hanging on through the Arctic winds and the cool temperatures. But there's an amazing diversity of plants out here. We've got so many different mosses and lichen. We also have multiple different varieties of berries and willow species. It's really cool. You might also notice a few trees dotting the landscape. There's more trees if you go further inland. But a lot of the trees around here are very small. Some of them also only have branches on one side of their trunk. We call those flag trees because the wind is battering them from one side. And those really small trees might be maybe 100 years old, but they're just growing really slowly. So the plants are out here, but they're just, they're taking their time, getting big. And as for the polar bear populations, well, that's a really interesting question. If we're looking worldwide, we really don't have a great idea of polar bear numbers. We have a rough estimate right now that polar bears are anywhere between 20 to 25,000 around the world. But it's really hard to study polar bears and to get really accurate estimates. So we're still working on getting a better estimate. And we know that there's 19 different populations of polar bears around the world, and we have good data for some, but almost no data for others. So we know that some polar bear populations have decreased in the last 20 years, including this one here, but others up in the higher Arctic, where the sea ice has been more stable, are still doing just fine. And so we want to make sure that the polar bears here don't continue to decline, and that the other polar bears continue doing just fine with their sea ice habitat. So really interesting question. Thank you.
Thanks for popping over.
Thanks for giving me a little cameo, guys.
Anytime. Jen, I have a question back for you if you want to come on back. Why have the polar bears become such a poster child for wildlife in the Arctic as opposed to other Arctic species? Is that something you could comment on, or that anyone could really comment on about the power of the polar bear?
I could comment briefly, and maybe we could go down the line. I feel like all of us were drawn. PBI invites us to come up and be on these panels, and we all have busy lives, but we all felt like this was an opportunity that really we couldn't say no to. For me personally, it's because polar bears are just captivating, and I think there's a lot that's happening to polar bears that kind of invites a conversation that may be hard to start otherwise. So you can start by talking about the polar bear and sea ice, and they're just such amazing creatures. And then really talk about climate and climate change, which is something that I'm passionate about communicating about, but it's not always the easiest topic to get started on.
Jack, did you want to go next?
Yeah, so polar bears, they have become sort of the icon of the Arctic. There's a lot of reasons why. One, they look very cuddly, but of course they can rip you to shreds. The other part is they live in an environment that what used to be called the canary in the coal mine, and I know many of you are too young to understand what that means, but essentially the environment that they live in it sort of gives us an understanding very quickly about what is going to be very important in the very near future. And so when you have what is called the top predator or the top species in that environment, you can call that an indicator species. So what used to be called, you probably heard the saying that frogs and things like salamanders were indicator species of an environment. meaning if there was problems within the environment, it would show up in frogs and salamanders and those types of things. And I think that's been applied to polar bears. So we have this messaging system of the Arctic environment, and the top species there in the environment is sort of the megaphone for environmental change. I think that's probably the most significant reason, along with that they look cute and cuddly and can rip people's faces off.
Did you want to add to that, Gerrit?
I think everything was well said. It's just, when we're talking about climate change, it's important to remember that, the polar bears are very much an indicator. But when you have an indicator, it's because there's a system behind it. So when we talk about polar bears, we're talking not only about them, but the ice they live on, and the plants in the surroundings, the other animals and surroundings, and the people who live in the region.
Mm-hmm. So one of the themes to protect the polar bears and to protect the planet is really reducing our carbon emissions. And there's another interesting piece of art that I'd like to share with you right now, and it came in from China. It's called The Price of Overdevelopment. And it's actually in Chinese, but the English description is there. And I thought Gerrit could maybe react to this piece and just comment on it a little bit.
I actually really like this piece, talking about overdevelopment and talking about what that means. And I know it was really interesting the last few weeks I've had the chance, just, browsing through the internet, a few articles have come up talking about overdevelopment in China. And so in some cases you have the government of China that's building buildings and malls and whatnot as, an economic driver trying to, boost jobs and whatnot in those regions, but that there aren't necessarily people who are going to move into these apartments or stores into these malls. And I think that really does spark the debate of where business and the environment need to find a balance. And I think that that's something that's really important and something we need to talk about. And then I think it also really does balance into what we're talking about in the Arctic. A lot of governments, a lot of businesses are looking north as an economic opportunity, saying, there's oil, there's gas, there's minerals in the region, and as much as it would have probably a very positive impact for the economy of a country, we need to look at the balance. What is the price of developing that? And I guess the message that comes to me when I saw that photo was, my parents would tell me as a kid, take what you need, but leave the rest for someone else. And I think that's what we need to ask. Do we really need it? Mm-hmm. And if not, we should probably leave it for someone else. And that someone else is Mother Earth, it's nature, it's leaving it the way it is for the survival of all species.
Mm-hmm. Well, you want to comment?
Thanks, Gerrit. What he said just reminded me of something, and it's going to tie into sort of probably our closing messages, or is, what can we do? Remember, the things that we consume as humans or use comes at the expense of something, and that's Mother Earth, and that's our environment. So just a quick message there.
Thank you. Well, everyone shared photos of climate change in their backyard. It would only be fair to share a photo of my backyard. So you're going to see soon a skyline of the city of Toronto. And this is a photo that I took from my phone. And there's some beauty, obviously, to a city. You see a few greens. It's actually on a rooftop garden that I had right in front. But it's a bit of a concrete jungle out there, and as someone who does live in a city and visiting the Arctic here this week and up in Nunavut last week, it definitely makes me reflect on how much I consume in my daily life. And what has been very inspiring for me is to meet people who are very inspired, and actually want to take you now to what students in Churchill, Manitoba are saying about climate change and what they can do. So what you're looking at right now is a photo of the whiteboard in Miss Megan Walk's class, a grade 5-6 class at the Duke of Marlborough School here in Churchill, Manitoba. Now you can see some of the writing yourself in terms of what the students came up with. They were asked what they want the government to do, what they think should happen. They're looking at the future of the Arctic and focused on solutions. So I'm going to point out a few things here that really impressed me, and then we can kind of close as a panel and everyone can share a closing thought. So the first one in the top left there, you see, write a letter to Mayor Mike. What is Churchill doing about climate change? That just sounds great. I really hope you guys get that letter going, and I can't wait to share it. Maybe you'll even see that letter in a future webcast. We can feature your letter. So what a great idea to write a letter to your mayor. So great thinking there. Another suggestion, I really like this one. It's on the right hand. Oh no, the bottom one says, start actually recycling. I like the highlight of actually. So you hear about recycling and you know that it's a good thing, and then people, they throw, let's say, recyclable products into the garbage and they're not recycling. Also the whole reuse. I know many entrepreneurs who are starting business ventures, creating out of plastic water bottles, creating thread and creating new types of clothing, so transforming things, upcycling, so finding creative uses of waste rather than putting them just out to sit there and harm our planet, especially the types of products that have toxics in it. And this last one, I've enlarged it a bit. It's on the top right. They should have a limit for how much bad stuff factories put in our air. So I think that's a really great point, to think about the limits of the pollution that goes into the air. So these are just some of the many ideas that grade 5 and 6 students are coming up with here in Churchill, Manitoba, and we hope to hear all about the ideas that you are coming up with. There's some photos of projects that Polar Bears International teams are working on, and you might have a chance to see photos from some of those teams. You see here, waiting, please don't idle. So if you're sitting in the car as a driver or passenger, let's not keep the car running if we don't need to. This is just one example of many projects that are going on with PBI. So you may get a chance to see a few more. I'd like to just close this panel by highlighting that we have an app called Commit to Act, and it looks at reducing our carbon footprint across 5 different category areas, that being food, waste, transportation, energy, and water. So you can really think about your actions on a daily basis and use this app as a way to keep track. And we also have Polar Bears Week starting just in a few days, the first week of November. So you and your friends can get involved and raise awareness that way. So let's just close and hear last words of advice from our panelists, starting with Gerrit.
I just want to encourage everyone out there to keep talking about it. Keep sharing the stories about what you're seeing in your backyard and about what's happening in your surroundings. Because when we talk about it, people listen. I said earlier, we are the connected generation. We have access to an incredible amount of information and ways to share this information. And when we do that, we encourage other people to do the same. We encourage our governments to take more meaningful actions. We encourage businesses to change some of their practices. So just don't let the conversation stop. It's only the beginning.
Thank you. Jen?
I really liked what was on the Churchill school board there, to start actually recycling. I think we should start actually reducing greenhouse gases. That would be an amazing step forward. And we've heard some pretty awesome progress, between China and the US. The number 1 and number 2 depends on what years you pick. Polluters on the planet, they're actually talking about how to reduce this. It's the big problem, and I think we should start actually dealing with it.
Thank you. Jack?
I think the most important thing that everybody listening needs to hear is stay in and finish school. Life is much easier once you have an education. So many of you may go on to work in this field, whether it be conservation, environmental science. One of the things you'll hear criticisms when you talk about climate change is that you're going to get responses from people that say climate change is just a natural part of the world of the earth. And, there used to be this thing called a dictionary, and a dictionary is what you use to look up the meanings of words. So I'm going to give you an assignment here. And when they talk about that climate change is just a part of nature, that's called natural precession, meaning that the Earth has sort of its own time scale that it goes through these climate changes. And I want you to pay attention here. There may be elements that this climate change is natural, But the key distinction of what we're really talking about here is the tempo at which these changes are occurring. So I think it's absolutely critical for those of you who are going on to study these things, that be one of the first things you familiarize yourself with.
Stay in school and keep asking questions, keep learning, keep exploring, keep being fascinated with the beauty of our planet. You can continue to stay connected by looking at the Polar Bears International iTunes U page and channel. There's also incredible teacher resources, and the goal of Polar Bears International is to keep polar bears in the Arctic always. And since this is my last webcast this week as host, I just want to give a special word of thanks to Polar Bears International and the very dedicated team. There are so many people working hard behind the scenes, and Halloween is just around the corner, so we're going to give a big pause up to all of you for watching and for the people who care in this buggy and around the world. Thank you for joining us. Bye.